Picture this: a 10-year-old in a mud brick house, father counting 3 coins by candlelight. In 72 hours, that boy will ride toward vermilion walls, and a knife heated over charcoal. Some called it purification. 4 million boys called it survival, if they lived at all. What would you trade to keep your family alive? Your voice, your body, your future? Step inside the Forbidden City's darkest economy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The practice of castration to create eunuch servants stretched back over 2 millennia in Chinese history, but it reached its most sophisticated and horrifying form during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Between 1368 and 1912 AD, an estimated 4 million boys underwent the procedure, with survival rates hovering around 60%. Those numbers aren't just statistics, they represent individual human beings, children with names and families and dreams, who were systematically mutilated to serve an imperial system that viewed them as expendable commodities. The economics of eunuch creation followed the same brutal logic as any other form of human trafficking. Desperate families sold their sons to professional castrators who operated networks spanning entire provinces. These men, known as knife masters, developed techniques refined over centuries of practice, passed down from father to son like any other family trade. They maintained workshops in major cities, complete with surgical tools, recovery facilities, and burial grounds for those who didn't survive. The most successful knife masters became wealthy, respected figures in their communities, their expertise in human mutilation treated as a legitimate medical specialty. Liu Dakui ran the most notorious castration workshop in Beijing during the late Qing period. His compound near the Drum Tower housed dozens of boys at various stages of the procedure and recovery. Visitors described the sounds that emanated from his workshops day and night. High-pitched screaming that would suddenly cut off, replaced by an unnatural silence that somehow seemed worse than the cries that preceded it. Liu employed a staff of assistants who specialized in different aspects of the process. Some held the boys during the operation. Others managed the recovery wards. Still others dealt with disposal of the dead and recruitment of new victims. The procedure itself was refined to maximize survival rates while minimizing the time and resources invested in each victim. Boys were starved for several days before the operation to reduce bleeding and prevent complications from vomiting during the trauma. They were given opium or alcohol to dull the pain, though never enough to render them completely unconscious. The knife masters insisted that the boys needed to remain aware during the procedure, claiming that unconscious patients were more likely to die from shock. The actual castration involved complete removal of both testicles and penis, using a curved knife heated over charcoal. The wound was immediately sealed with a mixture of hot oil and crushed herbs, then covered with paper soaked in cold water. A metal or bamboo tube was inserted into the urethra to prevent the opening from healing shut. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes determined whether a boy would survive to serve the emperor or join the thousands of nameless corpses buried in unmarked graves behind the workshop. Recovery was a nightmare of infection, fever, and constant pain that lasted for weeks. Boys were denied water for 3 days after the operation, a practice that knife masters claimed reduced swelling and prevented complications, though it more likely served to weed out the weak through dehydration. Those who survived the first week faced ongoing challenges as their bodies struggled to heal from the massive trauma. Many developed infections that killed them weeks or months later. Others suffered from chronic pain, difficulty urinating, or psychological breaks that left them catatonic. The lucky ones, if such a term can be applied to any victim of this system, were those whose families could afford to pay premium prices for the services of master castrators. These specialists maintained cleaner facilities, used sharper knives, and provided better aftercare that significantly improved survival rates. But even their victims endured the same fundamental brutality, the same irreversible mutilation, the same psychological trauma of having their bodies destroyed to serve imperial vanity. Wang Chenggen, who would later become one of the most powerful eunuchs in the Ming court, survived castration at age 9 in 1606 AD. Decades later, in private conversations recorded by court historians, he described the experience with a detachment that spoke to the psychological damage inflicted on all eunuch survivors. "I remember the smell of the heated knife," he recalled, "iron and charcoal and something else, something sweet that I later realized was the scent of burning flesh. I remember thinking that my father must be very hungry to trade me for a few coins. I remember the sound I made when the knife fell, though I cannot describe it in words. It was not human." The knife masters developed elaborate rituals around the castration procedure, partly to justify their actions to themselves, and partly to maintain control over their victims. Boys were told they were being purified for service to the Son of Heaven, that their sacrifice would bring honor to their families and ensure their own immortality through proximity to imperial power. These lies were repeated so often that some knife masters began to believe them, viewing themselves as priests performing sacred rites rather than butchers mutilating children for profit. Religious and philosophical justifications were woven throughout the eunuch creation system. Confucian scholars argued that eunuchs represented a necessary sacrifice to maintain the purity of the imperial household, that their altered state allowed them to serve female members of the royal family without threatening dynastic bloodlines. Taoist philosophers claim that castration freed men from base desires, allowing them to achieve higher spiritual states. Buddhist monks suggested that eunuchs had been chosen by karma to serve in their current lives as penance for sins in previous incarnations. These intellectual frameworks provided cover for a system driven entirely by practical considerations of power and control. Eunuchs could be trusted with access to imperial women because they posed no sexual threat. They developed fierce loyalty to the emperor because they had no families or prospects outside the palace. They could be worked without regard for their health or happiness because they were viewed as already dead, their essential humanity sacrificed along with their manhood. The transport of newly castrated boys from provincial workshops to the capital represented another layer of brutality in the system. Those who survived the initial procedure were loaded onto carts or boats for journeys that could take weeks, their wounds still healing, their bodies weakened by trauma and infection. Many died en route, their corpses dumped along roadsides or tossed into rivers without ceremony. The survivors arrived at the Forbidden City gates as hollow-eyed children, their spirits as mutilated as their bodies, ready to begin lives of servitude that would stretch across decades of isolation and abuse. The Forbidden City's eunuch quarters housed thousands of these damaged souls, organized into strict hierarchies based on age, skill, and imperial favor. New arrivals were assigned to senior eunuchs who completed their training in palace protocol, teaching them the complex rituals and customs that governed every aspect of imperial life. This training was itself a form of continued abuse, as boys learned to suppress any remaining traces of individual personality or desire, molding themselves into perfect servants whose only purpose was anticipating and fulfilling the whims of their imperial masters. Young eunuchs were forbidden from maintaining contact with their families, their former lives treated as contamination that might interfere with their dedication to palace service. They were given new names, often deliberately humiliating ones that emphasized their altered status and dependence on imperial mercy. Their old identities were erased as completely as their capacity for normal human relationships, leaving them suspended in a liminal state between life and death, between human and tool. The psychological impact of this systematic dehumanization cannot be overstated. Modern trauma research suggests that the combination of physical mutilation, social isolation, and ongoing abuse would have created complex post-traumatic stress disorders that manifested in various ways throughout these men's lives. Some became obsessively loyal to the emperor, transferring all their emotional needs onto the imperial family that had destroyed them. Others developed cruel, manipulative personalities, using whatever limited power they acquired to inflict suffering on those beneath them in the palace hierarchy. The selection process for eunuch recruits followed patterns that revealed the calculated cruelty underlying the entire system. Imperial agents scoured the countryside during times of famine, flood, or war, targeting families whose desperation made them vulnerable to offers that seemed like salvation but delivered only horror. These recruiters were often eunuchs themselves, men whose own childhood trauma had been channeled into perpetuating the cycle of abuse that had created them. They spoke persuasively to starving parents about the honor their sons would bring to the family name, the wealth that would flow back to their villages, the guaranteed food and shelter that palace service provided. But the recruiters also understood exactly which boys would survive the ordeal ahead. They looked for specific physical characteristics that suggested resilience. Broad shoulders that indicated good bone structure, clear skin that suggested absence of underlying disease, bright eyes that meant adequate nutrition in early childhood. Most importantly, they assessed psychological traits that would help boys endure not just the physical trauma of castration, but the decades of psychological abuse that awaited them in the palace. Boys who showed too much spirit were rejected as likely rebels. Those who seemed too weak were dismissed as poor investments. The ideal candidates displayed a particular combination of intelligence and malleability, smart enough to learn complex palace protocols, but broken enough to accept their fate without resistance. The journey to Beijing became the first stage of systematic psychological conditioning. Boys were chained together in groups of 20 or 30, loaded onto carts like livestock, and subjected to deliberate humiliation designed to break down their sense of individual worth. They were forbidden from speaking to each other, fed just enough to prevent starvation, and forced to relieve themselves while chained, creating conditions of filth and degradation that reinforced their status as less than human. Guards accompanying these transport convoys were specifically instructed to treat the boys with casual cruelty, beating them for minor infractions, mocking their fears, and constantly reminding them that they had been sold by families who no longer wanted them. Chen Hongmo, a Qing dynasty official who documented administrative practices throughout the empire, recorded witness testimony about these transport conditions in his private journals. The carts carrying these children to their fate move through our towns like funeral processions, he wrote in 1748 AD. The boys huddle together in silence, their faces already bearing the hollow look of the walking dead. Local residents turn away when the convoys pass, understanding instinctively that witnessing such systematic cruelty makes them complicit in it. Yet the trade continues because it serves imperial needs, and imperial needs supersede all considerations of human decency. Upon arrival in Beijing, the boys face their first encounter with the Forbidden City's vast bureaucracy of brutality. They were processed through intake facilities that functioned like slaughterhouses, where imperial physicians examined them for diseases or defects that might make them unsuitable for palace service. Those deemed inadequate were sold to private households or simply released to starve on Beijing streets. The accepted candidates were branded with hot irons, marking them as imperial property and ensuring they could never escape their fate even if they somehow managed to flee the palace grounds. The branding ceremony itself was designed as psychological theater, performed in front of all new arrivals to demonstrate the absolute power the imperial system held over their bodies and futures. Boys were forced to watch as their companions screamed under the heated metal, understanding that they would soon experience the same agony. The branded flesh was treated with salt and vinegar to prevent infection, but also to intensify the pain and create permanent scarring that would identify them as eunuchs for the rest of their lives. This marking served practical purposes, preventing escape attempts, but it also completed the psychological process of transforming human beings into property. The waiting period between arrival and castration could last weeks or months, during which boys were housed in dormitories that resembled prison cells more than living quarters. They slept on straw mats, ate thin gruel twice daily, and were forbidden from any activities that might be considered entertainment or comfort. This deliberate deprivation served multiple purposes. It weakened their physical resistance to the upcoming surgery, it reinforced their powerlessness within the system, and it created conditions where the prospect of palace service, even as mutilated servants, began to seem preferable to their current suffering. During this waiting period, older eunuchs would visit the dormitories to select boys who showed particular promise or attracted their attention. These visits were ostensibly part of the evaluation process, but they often involved sexual abuse that gave the boys their first taste of the exploitation that would define their palace years. The older eunuchs had been through the same experiences decades earlier, and many dealt with their own trauma by inflicting similar abuse on the next generation of victims. This created cycles of violence that perpetuated themselves across centuries, with each generation of survivors becoming perpetrators when they gained sufficient seniority within the palace hierarchy. The actual scheduling of castration procedures followed economic principles that treated human beings as manufacturing inputs. Knife masters timed operations to coincide with cooler weather, which reduced infection rates and improved survival statistics. They scheduled multiple procedures on the same days to maximize efficiency and minimize the time spent maintaining surgical facilities. Boys were processed in batches, with stronger candidates scheduled first when the knife master's energy and attention were at their peak, and weaker prospects relegated to later slots, when fatigue might affect the quality of the work. The night before castration, boys were subjected to ritual preparations that combined practical medical procedures with psychological manipulation designed to secure their compliance. Their heads were shaved completely, removing the last visible connection to their former identities. They were bathed in cold water mixed with herbs that were supposed to cleanse impurities, but actually served to lower their body temperature and reduce bleeding during surgery. Most cruelly, they were forced to drink mixtures containing mercury and other toxic substances that knife masters claimed would speed healing, but actually poisoned them in ways that manifested as chronic health problems years later. The final meal before castration became another form of psychological torture, as boys were given elaborate foods they had never tasted before. Exotic fruits, expensive wines, delicacies prepared by palace chefs. This feast was presented as an honor, a celebration of their upcoming transformation into servants of the emperor. In reality, it was designed to create a sense of gratitude and indebtedness that would make them more compliant during the procedure. The rich foods also served a practical purpose, providing nutrients that would help their bodies cope with the massive trauma they were about to endure. As dawn approached and the knife masters prepared their tools, the boys were arranged in order of procedure, often determined by arbitrary factors like height or the sound of their voices. Those scheduled for early morning operations were considered fortunate, as the knife masters would be fresh and the tools properly prepared. Boys assigned to later slots faced increased risks from dulled blades, fatigued operators, and tools contaminated by previous procedures. This randomness added another layer of cruelty to the system, as survival often depended on pure chance rather than any factors the boys could control. The workshops where these procedures took place were designed with efficiency rather than humanity in mind. Multiple operating stations allowed knife masters to work on several boys simultaneously, while assistants prepared the next batch of victims and disposed of those who didn't survive. The floors were sloped toward drains that carried away blood and other fluids, and the walls were thick enough to muffle the sounds that might disturb neighboring businesses. These facilities represented the industrialization of human mutilation, turning individual tragedies into routine manufacturing processes that could be scaled up or down based on imperial demand. The sound that filled those workshops defied description. It wasn't simply screaming, though. That was certainly part of it. It was something more primal, more fundamental, the sound of a human soul being torn from its moorings. The knife masters had grown so accustomed to these cries that they developed the ability to diagnose problems by audio alone. A sharp, brief shriek, followed by silence, meant successful completion. Prolonged wailing indicated complications that might require additional cutting. The absence of any sound at all usually meant the boy had died from shock before the procedure was finished. Zhang Weixian, who operated a castration workshop in Nanjing during the early Qing period, kept detailed records of his procedures that were discovered in 1923, when his former compound was demolished for urban development. His ledgers documented not just the names and ages of his victims, but clinical observations about which techniques produced the best survival rates. Boys from mountain villages endure the procedure better than those from farming communities, he noted in an entry from 1674. Their bodies are accustomed to hardship and heal more readily. City children, despite better nutrition, often die from shock within the first hour. The mind, it seems, matters as much as the flesh. These records revealed the systematic approach that professional castrators brought to their work. They tracked seasonal variations in survival rates, noting that procedures performed in autumn had better outcomes than those conducted during the hot summer months. They documented the effects of different preoperative preparations, comparing boys who had been starved for varying lengths of time against control groups who received normal meals. They even experimented with different blade materials and heating techniques, treating the mutilation of children like any other craft that could be improved through careful observation and refinement. The tools themselves became objects of reverence within the castration workshops. Knife masters maintained sets of curved blades forged from the finest steel, each one designed for specific aspects of the procedure. The primary cutting instrument was sharpened daily on whetstones imported from distant provinces. Its edge honed surgical precision. Secondary tools included forceps for grasping tissue, needles for closing wounds, and branding irons for sealing the raw flesh. These implements were passed down through generations of knife masters like family heirlooms, each one accumulating decades of blood and trauma that seemed to emanate from the metal itself. The heating process for the blades required precise timing and temperature control that knife masters guarded as trade secrets. The metal had to be hot enough to cauterize tissue instantly, but not so hot that it would cause excessive burning of surrounding flesh. Different workshops developed their own techniques. Some used charcoal braziers that could be carefully controlled. Others preferred wood fires that burned at more consistent temperatures. Still others experimented with oil flames that provided more precise heat application. The sound of steel being heated became a death knell for the boys waiting their turn. The hiss of metal reaching optimal temperature, meaning their moment of transformation had arrived. The physical restraint systems used during procedures evolved over centuries of practice, refined to maximize control while minimizing the number of assistants required. Boys were strapped to specially designed tables with leather bindings that could be tightened or loosened as needed. Their legs were spread and secured in metal stirrups that provided the knife master with optimal access while preventing any movement that might cause the blade to slip. Their arms were bound above their heads and chained to iron rings embedded in the table, creating complete immobilization that lasted throughout the procedure and initial recovery period. But the physical restraints were only part of the control system. Psychological manipulation played an equally important role in ensuring compliance. Boys were told repeatedly that struggling would only increase their pain and reduce their chances of survival. They were promised rewards for good behavior during the procedure, told that the emperor would personally recognize their courage if they endured the ordeal without resistance. Some knife masters employed assistants whose sole job was providing false comfort, whispering reassurances and promises that made the boys more likely to remain still while being mutilated. The immediate aftermath of castration revealed the true horror of what these children endured. Those who survived the initial shock found themselves in a twilight state between life and death, their bodies struggling to cope with massive trauma while their minds tried to process what had been done to them. The physical pain was overwhelming, described by survivors as fire consuming their entire lower body, but the psychological agony was often worse. Many boys experienced dissociative episodes, feeling as if they were floating above their own bodies, watching strangers suffer in their place. The recovery wards in major castration workshops resembled field hospitals from a particularly brutal war. Dozens of boys lay on straw mats, their bodies wrapped in crude bandages that needed constant changing, as wounds leaked blood and other fluids. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of infection, unwashed bodies, and the herbs used to treat complications. Attendants moved between the patients with buckets of water and rags, cleaning wounds and administering opium to those whose screaming became too disruptive for the other patients. Death during recovery was common enough that workshops maintained dedicated disposal systems for handling the constant stream of corpses. Bodies were typically stripped of any valuable clothing or possessions, then loaded onto carts for transport to mass burial sites outside the city walls. These graveyards became monuments to the human cost of imperial service, though they were deliberately located in remote areas where their existence wouldn't trouble the consciences of those who benefited from the eunuch system. The boys who survived faced weeks of agony as their bodies slowly healed from the massive trauma. Simple bodily functions became ordeals that required assistance and caused excruciating pain. Eating was difficult because the shock of castration often affected digestion, leaving survivors nauseated and unable to keep food down for days at a time. Sleep provided no relief, as any movement could tear healing tissue and restart bleeding that might prove fatal. Infection was the greatest threat during this period, and knife masters developed various treatments that ranged from genuinely helpful to actively harmful. Some used honey-based salves that actually possessed antibacterial properties, while others applied mixtures containing mercury or lead that poisoned patients while claiming to prevent disease. The most effective treatments were often the simplest: keeping wounds clean, changing bandages regularly, and ensuring patients received adequate nutrition to support their body's healing processes. The psychological support systems within these workshops were virtually non-existent. Boys were expected to endure their ordeal in silence, with any displays of emotion treated as weakness that might contaminate other patients. Those who cried were often beaten or denied food until they learned to suffer quietly. The few attendants assigned to patient care were typically the former eunuchs who had learned to suppress their own empathy as a survival mechanism, viewing the suffering around them with the same detachment they had developed toward their own trauma decades earlier. Some boys never recovered psychologically from the castration experience. They developed catatonic states that made them unresponsive to external stimuli, their minds retreating so far inward that they seemed to exist in different worlds entirely. Others experienced violent outbursts that required physical restraint and often resulted in additional injuries to their already damaged bodies. A few developed obsessive behaviors, performing the same actions repeatedly as if trying to restore some sense of control over their shattered existence. The successful survivors, those who healed physically and maintained enough mental function to serve in the palace, faced a different kind of trauma as they prepared for transport to the Forbidden City. They were forced to practice basic movements and functions that had once been natural, learning to walk and sit and perform daily activities with their altered bodies. Many discovered that their voices had changed, becoming higher-pitched or developing unusual tonal qualities that marked them as eunuchs for the rest of their lives. The final preparation for palace service involved training in basic etiquette and protocol that would allow the new eunuchs to function in the imperial household without immediately embarrassing themselves or their handlers. They learned to kowtow properly, to speak only when addressed, to move with the shuffling gait that was considered appropriate for their station. This training was conducted by senior eunuchs who had been sent from the palace specifically to evaluate and prepare new recruits, men whose own traumatic experiences had been channeled into perpetuating the system that had destroyed them. The graduation ceremony that marked the end of recovery and training was another exercise in psychological manipulation. Boys who had survived castration and initial healing were dressed in new clothes, fed a decent meal, and told they were now ready to serve the Son of Heaven in the most sacred place on earth. They were encouraged to feel grateful for this opportunity, to see their suffering as a necessary sacrifice that had elevated them above ordinary mortals. The ceremony was designed to create a sense of accomplishment and belonging that would help bind them to the imperial system that had mutilated them. But beneath the ritual pageantry lay the cold reality of what these boys had become. They were no longer fully human in the eyes of Chinese society, existing in a liminal space between male and female, between servant and possession, between living and dead. Their castration had transformed them into tools designed for specific purposes within the imperial household. Their individual personalities and desires subordinated entirely to the needs of their emperor and his family. The transport from provincial workshops to Beijing represented the final stage of their transformation from children into imperial property. They were loaded onto closed carriages that prevented them from seeing the world they were leaving behind, their last connections to normal human society severed as completely as their manhood had been. The journey itself became another form of conditioning, as they learned to exist in confined spaces with other damaged souls, all of them bound for lives of service in the most isolated and artificial environment in China. As these carriages rolled toward the capital, carrying their cargo of mutilated children to serve in the Forbidden City, they represented more than just human trafficking. They embodied the fundamental cruelty of a political system that viewed human beings as raw materials to be processed and consumed for the convenience of absolute power. The boys inside those carriages had paid the ultimate price for imperial stability, their sacrifice ensuring that the emperor could maintain his celestial authority without the complications that intact men might bring to his household. The Forbidden City awaited them with its own forms of brutality and exploitation, but those were still to come. For now, these damaged children could only endure the swaying of the carriages and try not to think about what they had lost, what they were becoming, and what horrors might still await them in the palace of the Son of Heaven. The gates of the Forbidden City loomed before them like the entrance to another world, their vermilion paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, while golden door studs caught the light like watching eyes. As the carriages passed through layer after layer of security, each checkpoint marked another step away from the world of ordinary humanity and deeper into the artificial universe of imperial power. The boys pressed against the small windows, catching glimpses of courtyards so vast they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, of buildings with roofs that curved toward heaven like frozen waves, of gardens where every tree and stone had been placed according to principles they could never hope to understand. The sound of their wheels on ancient cobblestones echoed off walls that had witnessed centuries of suffering, mixing with the distant chanting of court officials and the rhythmic footsteps of guards whose entire existence revolved around protecting the sanctity of imperial isolation. The air itself felt different here, thicker somehow, weighted with incense and secrets and the accumulated breath of thousands of souls who had entered these walls and never truly left, even in death. Upon arrival at the eunuch quarters, the boys encountered their first taste of the hierarchy that would govern every moment of their remaining lives. Senior eunuchs emerged from shadowed doorways like spiders, sensing vibrations in their web, their faces bearing expressions that mixed cruelty with something that might have been recognition. These men had once been boys like them, had once cowered in similar carriages, had once felt the same terror and confusion. But decades of palace life had transformed them into something else entirely, creatures who had learned to find meaning and even pleasure in perpetuating the cycle of abuse that had created them. The head of the eunuch quarters was a man whose original name had been lost to history, replaced by the title Superintendent of Imperial Servants. His face was a map of calculated malice, every line carved by years of navigating palace intrigue while suppressing any trace of human compassion that might interfere with his duties. He examined each new arrival with the practiced eye of a livestock dealer, noting physical characteristics that would determine their placement within the palace hierarchy. Strong backs meant assignment to manual labor. Delicate features suggested potential for serving in the inner chambers. Intelligence, if detected, could lead to clerical positions that offered slightly better treatment, but also attracted more dangerous attention from court officials. You are no longer the sons of farmers or merchants or beggars. He informed each group of new arrivals, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power over their fates. You are no longer Chinese, no longer human in the way you once understood the term. You exist now only to serve the Son of Heaven and his sacred household. Your thoughts, your desires, your very breath belongs to the Emperor. Those who remember this will live. Those who forget will provide lessons for others. The initial processing involved stripping away the last vestiges of their former identities. Their names were recorded in ledgers that would be locked away and forgotten, replaced by numerical designations that reduced them to inventory items in the palace's vast bureaucratic machine. Their hair was cut according to strict regulations that marked their status as neither fully male nor female, creating a distinctive appearance that would identify them instantly to anyone familiar with court customs. Their clothes were burned in ceremonial fires, the smoke carrying away their final connections to the world beyond the palace walls. The dormitories where they would spend their first months resembled military barracks designed by someone who had never known human comfort. Rows of wooden platforms served as beds, each one barely wide enough for a single person and separated from its neighbors by just enough space to prevent conversation. The walls were bare stone that sweated moisture in summer and radiated cold in winter, creating an environment that seemed designed to suppress any possibility of joy or contentment. Windows were placed too high to offer views of the outside world, letting in light but ensuring that the occupants remained focused inward on their new reality. The daily routine began before dawn with the sound of wooden clappers that echoed through the corridors like gunshots, jolting the boys from whatever fitful sleep they had managed to achieve. Within minutes, they were expected to be standing beside their beds in perfect formation, ready for the first of many inspections that would punctuate their days. Senior eunuchs moved through the ranks like generals reviewing troops, noting any signs of illness, disobedience, or insufficient enthusiasm for palace service. Those who failed these inspections faced punishments that ranged from reduced food rations to beatings that left permanent scars. The training regimen that followed was designed to break down whatever remained of their individual personalities and rebuild them as perfect servants. They learned to walk with the shuffling gait that was considered appropriate for eunuchs, their movements restricted by both physical limitations from their mutilation and behavioral expectations that demanded complete subservience. They practiced bowing and kowtowing until the motions became automatic responses to the presence of authority, their bodies conditioned to display submission even when their minds might harbor other thoughts. Language training formed a crucial part of their conditioning, as they learned the elaborate forms of address required for different levels of the imperial hierarchy. A single mistake in pronunciation or tone could result in severe punishment, so they spent hours each day reciting phrases and responses until they could perform them flawlessly even under stress. They learned to speak in the high, soft voices that were expected from eunuchs, their vocal cords trained to produce sounds that reinforced their ambiguous gender status and marked them as fundamentally different from ordinary men. The palace protocol they memorized was so complex that it seemed designed more to create opportunities for failure than to facilitate actual service. They learned which doors they could use and which were forbidden, which paths through the courtyards were appropriate for their status, and which would result in immediate punishment if traversed. They memorized the schedules and preferences of dozens of court officials, from the emperor himself down to minor functionaries whose whims could determine whether a eunuch lived or died. Every gesture, every expression, every moment of their existence was governed by rules that had been refined over centuries to maximize their usefulness while minimizing their humanity. The food provided during training was calculated to maintain their health while reinforcing their dependent status. Thin rice porridge formed the base of most meals, supplemented by vegetables that were often past their prime and small portions of fish or meat that provided just enough protein to prevent malnutrition. The contrast with the elaborate feast they glimpsed being prepared for palace inhabitants was deliberate, a constant reminder that they existed at the bottom of a hierarchy that stretched from their straw mats to the dragon throne itself. Medical care during this training period revealed another layer of the systematic dehumanization they faced. Palace physicians treated eunuchs like valuable but ultimately replaceable equipment, providing enough care to maintain their functionality while showing no concern for their comfort or well-being. Injuries from training or punishment were treated with efficient brutality, the focus entirely on returning the damaged eunuch to service as quickly as possible. Illness was viewed with suspicion, as malingering was considered a serious offense that could result in expulsion from the palace or worse. The psychological conditioning during this period was perhaps more brutal than the physical training. The boys were forced to participate in ceremonies that celebrated their mutilation, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to serve in the imperial household while suppressing any natural anger or grief about what had been done to them. They were required to write letters to their families, if they could write, describing their new lives in terms that emphasized honor and privilege rather than suffering and exploitation. These letters were heavily censored and often rewritten entirely by senior eunuchs, but the act of creating them served to reinforce the official narrative about their transformation. The isolation from the outside world was total and deliberate. No news reached them about events beyond the palace walls. No messages arrived from family members. No contact was permitted with anyone who might remind them of their former lives. This sensory and emotional deprivation was designed to make the palace their entire universe, eliminating any reference points that might allow them to maintain perspective about their situation. They existed in a bubble of artificial reality where the emperor's needs were the only concerns that mattered, and their own suffering was invisible. The senior eunuchs who supervised their training were products of the same system, men whose own traumatic experiences had been channeled into perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Many had developed sadistic personalities that found pleasure in the suffering of those beneath them, while others had retreated into emotional numbness that made them indifferent to the pain they inflicted. A few maintained traces of human compassion, but these feelings had to be carefully hidden, as any display of mercy toward new recruits was viewed as weakness that could threaten their own positions. Competition was deliberately fostered among the trainees as another form of psychological control. They were told that only the most dedicated and skilled would advance to positions of real responsibility, while failures would be relegated to the most degrading forms of service. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and betrayal, as boys informed on each other in hopes of gaining favor with their supervisors. Friendships were discouraged and often punished, while those who showed loyalty only to the Imperial system were rewarded with slightly better treatment. The evaluation process that determined their eventual assignments was based on criteria that reduced human beings to collections of useful traits. Physical strength and endurance indicated suitability for manual labor in the palace workshops or gardens. Intelligence and memory suggested potential for clerical work that involved maintaining the vast records required to operate the imperial bureaucracy. Appearance and demeanor determined who might be selected for service in the inner chambers, where they would have direct contact with members of the imperial family but also face the greatest dangers from court intrigue. The most coveted positions were those that offered some degree of authority over other eunuchs, as these roles provided the only available path to power and respect within their constrained world. But advancement came at a terrible price, requiring the complete abandonment of human empathy in favor of absolute dedication to imperial service. Those who succeeded in climbing the eunuch hierarchy became the most effective agents of oppression, their intimate understanding of suffering making them uniquely qualified to inflict it on others. The psychological profiles that emerged from this training revealed the systematic destruction of human personality that the eunuch system accomplished. Some boys developed multiple personalities as a defense mechanism, creating internal personas that could endure different aspects of their torment while protecting some core sense of self. Others experienced complete dissociation, becoming automata that performed their duties perfectly, while their consciousness retreated to unreachable depths. Still others channeled their trauma into obsessive behaviors that provided some illusion of control over their powerless existence. The dreams that plagued them during their brief periods of rest offered no escape from their waking nightmare. Many reported recurring visions of their castration, their minds replaying the trauma endlessly as if trying to process an experience too horrible to integrate into normal memory. Others dreamed of their families, creating elaborate fantasies about reunions that they knew would never occur. Some experienced nightmares about the palace itself, imagining the buildings and courtyards as living entities that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each new victim. The seasonal rhythms that governed palace life created their own forms of torture for the eunuch trainees. Summer brought stifling heat that made their recovery from castration even more miserable, while winter cold penetrated their inadequate clothing and sleeping areas. Spring festivals that celebrated renewal and fertility were particularly cruel reminders of what they had lost, while autumn harvests highlighted the productivity they would never achieve through families of their own. Each season marked another cycle of their imprisonment, another year stolen from lives that had been sacrificed to imperial vanity. The religious ceremonies they were forced to participate in added another layer of psychological manipulation to their conditioning. They prayed for the emperor's health and prosperity while their own bodies bore the wounds of his system's cruelty. They offered incense for the continuation of the dynasty that had mutilated them, performing rituals that celebrated the very power structure that viewed them as expendable tools. These ceremonies were designed to create cognitive dissonance that would make it harder for them to maintain clear thinking about their situation. The gradual revelation of palace secrets that came with their training served to bind them more tightly to their captors. They learned about court intrigues, financial irregularities, and personal scandals that would make them valuable assets but also dangerous liabilities if they ever attempted to leave. This knowledge was shared deliberately, creating a web of complicity that made escape not just physically difficult, but psychologically complex. They became repositories of information that could destroy powerful people, but only at the cost of their own destruction. The artistic and cultural education they received was designed to make them more useful as servants while reinforcing their subordinate status. They learned calligraphy so they could copy documents for their masters, but were forbidden from expressing original thoughts in writing. They studied music so they could provide entertainment, but were never allowed to compose pieces that reflected their own experiences. They memorized poetry that celebrated imperial glory while being prohibited from creating verses that acknowledged their own suffering. As their training neared completion, the boys who had survived the multiple layers of physical and psychological brutality were no longer recognizable as the children who had entered the palace months earlier. Their bodies had been altered not just by castration, but by the systematic suppression of normal human development. Their minds had been shaped by trauma and conditioning into forms that prioritized imperial service above all other considerations. Their spirits had been broken and reformed according to specifications that maximized their utility, while minimizing their capacity for independent thought or action. The final examinations that would determine their placement within the palace hierarchy represented another form of dehumanization, as they were evaluated like livestock or machinery rather than human beings. Their physical capabilities were tested through grueling exercises that pushed their altered bodies to their limits. Their mental abilities were assessed through complex memorization tasks that demonstrated their capacity for storing and retrieving information on command. Their emotional stability was evaluated through deliberate provocations designed to identify those who might crack under the pressure of palace service. The ceremony that marked their graduation from training to active service was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that transformed their mutilation into a celebration of imperial benevolence. They were dressed in new uniforms that marked their status as official palace servants, fed a meal that was luxurious by their recent standards, and told they were now privileged to serve the Son of Heaven in the most sacred place on earth. Senior officials delivered speeches about their honor and importance, carefully avoiding any mention of the price they had paid for these supposed privileges. But as they prepared to take their places in the vast machine of palace service, these newly minted eunuchs carried within their damaged bodies and shattered minds the accumulated trauma of a system that had consumed their childhoods and transformed them into living tools. They were about to enter a world where their survival would depend on their ability to navigate deadly court intrigues while suppressing every natural human instinct that might interfere with their service to absolute power. The corridors of the Forbidden City stretched before them like arteries in a vast organism that fed on human sacrifice, ready to absorb them into its endless appetite for suffering in service of imperial glory. Their training was complete, but their true education in the art of surviving as less than human was just beginning. The assignment system that determined where these broken children would spend their remaining lives operated with the cold efficiency of a machine designed to extract maximum value from human wreckage. Palace administrators had refined the process over centuries, developing categories that reduced complex human beings to simple classifications based on utility. The strongest survivors found themselves destined for the construction crews that maintained the vast complex, their damaged bodies pressed into service hauling stone and timber under the scorching sun or bitter winter winds. Those with steadier hands and sharper eyes were assigned to the workshops where they would spend decades crafting luxury items for imperial use, their fingers bleeding over silk embroidery and jade carvings that would never bear their names. The most intelligent recruits faced a different kind of torment, as they were selected for the administrative bureaus that managed the palace's endless paperwork. These positions offered slightly better living conditions, but came with dangers that manual laborers never faced. Clerk eunuchs had access to sensitive information that made them valuable to competing court factions, but also marked them for elimination when political winds shifted. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which officials were rising and which were falling, adjusting their loyalties accordingly while maintaining the fiction that they served only the emperor himself. Zhang Yongming, who survived castration in 1743 and spent 40 years in the Palace Bureau of Records, left behind journals that reveal the psychological contortions required to navigate this world of perpetual danger. His writings, discovered sealed inside a false wall during renovations in 1924, describe an existence where every conversation was a potential trap, and every document contained hidden meanings that could spell death for those who misinterpreted them. We learn to think like ghosts, he wrote, present but not present, seeing but not seeing, knowing but never acknowledging what we know. The selection process for service in the inner chambers followed different criteria entirely, focusing on physical beauty and emotional malleability rather than strength or intelligence. These eunuchs would have direct contact with imperial wives and concubines, making them potentially valuable sources of information, but also extremely vulnerable to accusations of improper conduct. A single misunderstood glance or carelessly spoken word could result in execution, while success in these positions might lead to influence that bordered on actual power within the palace hierarchy. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively ruled China for nearly 50 years, surrounded herself with eunuchs who had been selected as much for their psychological damage as their competence. She understood instinctively that men whose capacity for normal relationships had been destroyed made ideal servants for a woman whose own humanity had been sacrificed to political necessity. Her chief eunuch, Li Lianying, had survived castration at age 9 and channeled his trauma into absolute devotion to the woman who represented the only source of security in his shattered world. The daily routines that governed eunuch life in their various assignments were designed to prevent any development of independent identity or personal relationships. They woke before dawn to the sound of wooden clappers that echoed through the corridors like gunshots, their days structured around the needs of their masters with no consideration for their own physical or emotional requirements. Meals were eaten in silence, work was performed without conversation, and sleep came only after completing whatever tasks their superiors deemed necessary, regardless of the hour. The hierarchy among eunuchs themselves created additional layers of suffering, as those who had endured the system longest often became its most cruel enforcers. Senior eunuchs who had spent decades suppressing their own humanity found purpose in ensuring that younger colleagues experienced similar psychological destruction. They created elaborate hazing rituals that went far beyond the official training requirements, using their authority to inflict casual cruelties that served no purpose except to demonstrate their power over those even more powerless than themselves. The punishment system that maintained discipline among the eunuch population was calibrated to cause maximum psychological damage while preserving the victim's ability to work. Physical beatings were administered with bamboo rods that left lasting scars without causing permanent disability. Food deprivation weakened bodies and spirits while stopping short of starvation that would reduce productivity. Isolation in windowless cells drove men to the edge of madness while maintaining their capacity to return to service once their punishment was complete. The most feared punishment was expulsion from the palace, which meant certain death for men who had been so thoroughly adapted to institutional life that they lacked any capacity for independent survival. Former eunuchs who found themselves cast out onto Beijing streets typically died within weeks, their altered bodies and broken spirits unable to cope with a world that viewed them as abominations. The threat of expulsion hung over every eunuch like a sword, ensuring compliance even when physical punishment might have failed to motivate proper behavior. The practice of eunuch creation finally ended with the collapse of Imperial China in 1912, but its legacy lingers in ways that challenge our comfortable assumptions about human progress. The last palace eunuch, Sun Yaoding, died in 1996, carrying with him memories of a system that had consumed millions of lives over 2 millennia. His death marked the end of an unbroken chain of suffering that stretched back to the Han Dynasty, a testament to humanity's capacity for institutionalizing cruelty in service of power. Today, as we walk through the restored courtyards of the Forbidden City, now transformed into a museum that celebrates China's imperial grandeur, we tread on ground that was once soaked with the blood and tears of children whose only crime was being born into poverty. The vermilion walls that tourists admire were maintained by hands that trembled not from age but from trauma, polished by men whose voices would forever carry the high notes of their mutilation. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about civilization itself. That our greatest achievements often rest on foundations of systematic brutality that we choose to forget. The magnificent palaces, the exquisite art, the philosophical traditions that emerged from Imperial China came at a price paid by millions of boys who never lived to become men. Their sacrifice enabled the isolation and absolute power that emperors required, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of any system that maintains itself through the destruction of human beings. The eunuch system wasn't an aberration or a historical accident. It was the logical result of political structures that viewed people as resources to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of dignity. Every society creates its own versions of this dynamic, finding ways to transform human suffering into institutional stability. The specific methods may change, but the underlying logic remains disturbingly constant across cultures and centuries. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't just what was done to these children, but how completely their stories have been erased from our collective memory. History remembers the emperors and their achievements, but forgets the mutilated servants who made those achievements possible. In choosing to forget, we make ourselves complicit in the very system of dehumanization that created such horrors in the first place.